Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashim Yahushai, Ba'ashim Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone for teaching us the truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to, do a just to discuss, blessings and, certain things, within our, walk sometimes they might arise and essentially not to block your blessings, because sometimes doing those particular things can be, can turn out to be favorable, for you, especially in times to come, because if there's something that personally for me I think about is the scriptures when the scriptures talk about how my servants shall eat, right? And not knowing how exactly that might play out, but knowing that it will play out. But what I'm saying, like, you doing particular things, that can be essentially a benefit for you, especially in these times with wars and rumors of wars, as the scriptures say, the love of many shall wax cold, so on and so forth, right? So, not essentially, to observe certain opportunities that might come that actually might be a very good spiritual benefit, for you, spiritual blessing upon you, right? Um, so this isn't really going to be, too long. I kind of just wanted to hit, a couple precepts here and there, just to pay attention, because a lot of these things, we see these things coming to pass. You see there's a stirring up of the kings of the other nations, in that mindset for war, right? So, ultimately, we want to have as much, you can say as much blessings as much as possible, you know, um, especially in these times, right? Because the scriptures also do say that, riches, you know, don't profit in a day of wrath, but, righteousness can deliver from death, right? So, how much more, examples of your righteousness to be an example, to be not, to be essentially a covering, within, those particular, times, right? So, I guess I'll just start here in the book of First Peter's, and sincerely, hopefully, this lesson is just quick and edifying, right? Um, this is First Peter's chapter 4, verse 7, and it says, "But the end of all things is at hand. Be therefore sober and watch unto prayer." And it says here, "And above all things, have fervent charity amongst yourselves, for charity, shall cover a multitude of sins," right? So we know we're in a situation where we've transgressed, we've fallen short, right? So, this is an opportunity to, because the Lord will specifically put us, from, observation, will put us in opera in situations where we have to exemplify certain like fruits of the spirit, right? Exemplify certain things, whether it might be to, you might have to, give some time, for a brother or whatever, right? Sometimes, there's sometimes these situations come up with, sometimes in like immediate family and whatnot. These things can be essentially, a blessing. You know what I'm saying? So I'll read verse 9 here, and it says, "Use hospitality, one to another without grudging," right? Because we know we're not held our righteousness. Yes, it's likened unto filthy rags, right? But at the same time, those we're not held to that heavy standard of, the heavy standard of the old covenant. We're not held to that high standard. We model ourselves essentially after Yahushai, right? And Yahushai, particularly, he washed, disciples' feet, right? So, he showed a certain, not, I guess you can say, yeah, servitude, basically, right? And charity, and don't get me wrong though, like charity is not something that's just limited to like um, money, as the Catholic Church likes to put it, in terms of tithes and so on and so forth. And now that, yes, that was a big thing, back then, when we were in the land, right? Different, like for example, when you go into like first fruits and so on and so forth, what the tribes would do, you know, the other tribes, other than the tribe of Levi, of course, the priests, they didn't actually have that, that physical allotment, because the Levites, basically um their what do you call it, their allotment, basically their inheritance, was really, to actually administer the priest office, and take care of priestly duties and so on and so forth, right? So the different tribes, they had to essentially, what they would do, especially with first fruits. As a matter of fact, let me read a little bit of it, just for understanding. What's that? Deuteronomy 26, I believe. Let's see if I get it in another version. One second, just bear with me. I kind of just want to hit the point, because we see all these things coming to pass, right? But this isn't, also on a flip end, it can be an opportunity. Sometimes we might, there are opportunities for us to exemplify certain fruits of the spirit, basically, right? Let me get it in the NLT. So it says harvest offerings and tithes, and it says Deuteronomy 26, verse 1 in the NLT here. And it says, when you enter the land that the Lord your power, Yahweh, is giving you as a special possession, and you have conquered it and settled there, put some of your first produce from each of the of your harvest into a basket, and bring it to a designated place of worship. Let the place that the Lord your power, Yahweh, chooses for his name to be honored, go to the priest in charge at that time, and say to him, I'm sorry, with this gift I acknowledge to the Lord your power that I have entered the land, and he swore to our ancestors that he would give us. The priest will then give the basket from your hand. Will take the basket from your hand and set it before the altar, your power. You must say then, in the presence of the Lord, your power, my ancestor Jacob was wandering Aramean, who went to live as a foreigner in Egypt, right? So they're basically describing the events, especially, when we went down into Egypt, and then, we sojourned there because there was a famine and so on and so forth, right? So when we had the abundance, it was essentially to bring our people into remembrance when they had very, essentially little, right? So what I want to do real quick, I want to jump down. I'll read verse 12, right? And it says here, every third year you must offer a special tithe of your crops. In this year of the special tithe, you must give your tithes to the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and widows, so that they will have enough to eat in your towns. You must declare in the presence of the Lord, and have taken the sacred gift of my house, and have given it to the Levites, the foreigners, the widows, and orphans and widows, just as you commanded me, and I have not violated or forgotten any of your commands, right? So this, essentially what happened was, because this is where really the Catholic Church gets this idea of like tithes and, taking tithes and stuff like that from. But they essentially they're so wicked, where they take it and they manipulate the people, they give the people the wrong message, and so on and so forth. But the point really is that, Israel, they would give those particular offerings or offerings of first fruits back to the priests, right? Because these particular categories of people that were listed, so you had the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. So there were people who were essentially less fortunate. And I don't want to say Levites were less fortunate because there were towns where they can actually sojourn in, but the point really is that um, the Levites didn't have that physical allotment of the land, right? As opposed to the other tribes where their job was really to do a lot of the more temple service, tabernacle service, and burning incense, what I'm saying, actually teaching people the law. So they had that. They were a little bit more occupied, right? So understanding teaching our people understanding the of okay, this is holy and this is profane, this and that and the fourth, diagnosing certain things that like lepers and so on and so forth, right? So they had essentially a bigger they had a lot of responsibility already on their plate. So because of that, they had to, they couldn't work, right? Just like we have in a situation where we have to work, right? But the point really is that they had to give their portions, their I guess you can say resources, their offerings, I should say, as a sacrifice to actually make sure that these people were taken care of, especially when you look at the foreigners, the orphans, the widows. Those were the people who were a little bit more like they were less well off, so to speak, right? So it was a way for have them to be taken care of, right? So those were particular things that we would do, to ensure that the welfare of the people were okay, right? So, bringing it all home, it's really, those are like, doing those things, can act, as blessings because, right, in the scriptures say, when you give according to the little that you have, right? And back to my earlier point, it's not limited to just money, right? It could be time, it could be phone calls sometimes, lending an ear, so on and so forth, right? Because a lot of these things, a lot of these situations do arise, to exemplify how shy to exemplify the fruits of the spirit, in certain situations, right? Because we don't really we have an idea of some of the situations we might go through, but like how much to be essentially protected and looked after, in those particular situations, right? Examples of miracles, so on and so forth, where the Lord intervenes for you, you know what I'm saying? In times of, in those times of trouble, right? Because as I said before, riches don't profit, in a day of wrath, right? So there are certain opportunities that might come about, for example, like, having a phone call. Well, I don't know, I'm just using that as an example, right? To actually exemplify certain, fruits of the spirit, right? So, let me just get a quick example, and I guess that'll be, I'll just get a quick example here. This is 1 Samuel 25, verse 18. And it says here, it says, Abigail wasted no time. She quickly gathered, 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins of wine, 5 sheep that had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 fig cakes. She packed them on donkeys and said to her servants, "Go on ahead, I will follow you shortly." But she didn't tell her husband Nabal what she was doing. And as she was riding her donkey into the mountain ravine, she saw David and his men coming toward her. David had just been saying a lot of good it would help this fellow. We protected his flocks in the wilderness, and Nothing he owned was lost or stolen, but he has repaid me evil for good. May the Most High strike me and kill me if one man of this household is still alive tomorrow morning. And when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off the donkey and bowed low before him, and she fell at his feet and said, I accept the blame for this matter, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man, which is Nabal is basically your husband, right? And it says here, please don't pay any attention to him. He is a fool, just as his name suggests. But I have never even saw the young man you sent, right? So this is essentially the wife Abigail making basically intervening on Nabal's behalf. Nabal had an opportunity to essentially help out David and his men. Even David actually did a job for him. The point really is that he had an opportunity. Nabal here essentially had an opportunity to do good essentially to a king, right? Because he wasn't king at the time, but the point really is that he at some point he will become king, right? So he didn't consider, essentially he kind of looked down on him, right? Is this the son of Jesse? You know what I'm saying? Like he kind of looked down upon David at this point in his walk in his life, right? So he essentially, the point really is, Nabal here, he squandered that blessing, because he didn't see it as essentially an opportunity to do good to this person here, right? And the scriptures talk about that, in terms of when you do good, knowing basically, to roughly paraphrase, who you do good to, right? So he had the opportunity, and eventually he squandered it, he spoiled it, he wasted it, right? But they see the difference between the characters here, between Abigail here and Nabal here, where she actually capitalized on the opportunity and actually took accountability as well. Yes, it's a good example. It shows that she even made haste, right? So just like we're living in a time we're making haste to you know not just basically stay closer to the Lord, right? And these opportunities can come up among us, brethren, right? To do good, because we never know how much of those blessings can still play out for us in times of trouble, right? Because that's really what we need. We need an advocate, a high priest to intervene, to protect us, in those times, right? Because like the money in our accounts is not gonna save us. I'm just gonna keep it 100, right? What's that? 1 Corinthians 9. Let me go back to KJV 1 second. This is 2 Corinthians 9. Verse 7, and it says, every man according to as he proposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly, of necessity, for the Most High loveth a cheerful giver. And the Most High is able to make all grace abound towards you, excuse me, always having all sufficiency in all things, that may abound to every good work, right? So it's very, very good to be in that spirit to give, right? And again, like I said, giving is not limited to just money, right? Giving, this, the lessons is also an opportunity to give, right? You give back, understanding, is open up to you, in regards to certain things, you give it back, to actually feed the flock, right? Those things, that's another method, of giving, right? We're giving it back, just like how you saw the Israelites back in that time, they would give the Lord, blessed us with the land. And the Israelites, what they would do is they would give their offerings, their tithes, their basically their first fruits, back to the Lord as an offering, right? So it would be used to be able to actually take care of those who were, I don't want to say they weren't all, they were, some of them that were not as well off, basically, and as an opportunity, to do as the Lord commanded, right? Essentially, it was also to kind of consider those that were essentially less fortunate, right? So, that's pretty much, as a matter of fact, I'll end off with this last one in the Apocrypha, because it says somewhere about observing the opportunity. And I'll leave it there, not to make the lesson, too long. Let's see, I think it's is it Sirach 3? Okay, I think it's Sirach 4. Just bear with me on this. Oh, okay, Sirach 4, verse 20, and it says, observe the opportunity and beware of evil, and be not ashamed when it concerneth thy soul, right? So, it's an opportunity, sometimes we have opportunities that might come up, within our day-to-day to actually do good, right? So, anyways, I just wanted to, just touch quickly on that. Lord's will, this was edifying. Just like to give our praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.